Welcome to the Provoke and Inspire podcast, learning how to follow Jesus in a post-Christian context and culture. My name is Ben Pierce. I am the host of the show, and I have a very, very special episode for you today. I had the privilege of interviewing Philip Yancey. For those who are unfamiliar, he is an American author whose writings explore the most basic questions and the deepest mysteries of the Christian faith. He's written many best-selling books, including The Jesus I Never Knew, What's So Amazing About Grace, and Prayer, Does It Make a Difference? His books have sold more than 17 million copies in English and have been translated into 50 languages. This makes him one of the best-selling contemporary Christian authors ever. I'm very, very excited about his most recent book. It's a memoir, Where the Light Fell, and this is what we spend a lot of time talking about. His story is brutal. It's gripping. He's so honest and vulnerable. During the discussion, we talk about deconstruction. We talk about how you can speak to someone who is far from God. We look at some of the things that drew him to Jesus and how these can be powerful tools for the people in our lives who don't know God. It's an awesome conversation. One of the best I feel like I've maybe ever had on this podcast. I could not recommend that you check this out anymore. I really think you'll be encouraged by it. And just as a reminder, this podcast is part of a missions organization called Steiger. We reach and disciple the global youth culture, basically young people, really anyone who is far from God. And we mobilize followers of Jesus to do the same. This is our passion. We want you to get involved with us. And for more information and resources, you can go to steiger.org. steiger.org. Also, if this podcast means something to you, if it's encouraged you in any way, would you leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this? That would mean a ton to us. You can also send us an email at provokeandinspirepodcast@steiger.org. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoy this interview with author Philip Yancey. Look, like I said, I am beyond grateful that you've been so faithful for so many years. God has used you so powerfully. So thank you. Thank you for joining the Provoke and Inspire podcast.
Absolutely.
Selfishly, I want to talk about your most recent book, Where the Light Fell, and go through your story if you'd be willing.
Sure.
But just selfishly, as someone who, I reluctantly say write, but dabbles and tries to produce content that would hopefully inspire people. And I know many of the listeners of this podcast do as well. And so what kind of guidance would you give as someone who's done this for so long? It's a very vague question, I know, but are there maybe some unique opportunities and challenges that writers, artists, content creators of sort of this day face in your mind?
Yeah, in a way, I guess I would say this is the best of times and the worst of times to be a writer. Let's start with the worst. It's the worst of times because it's hard to make a living at it.
Yeah.
When I started out, it was possible. I started with a magazine, and then I started writing books one by one while I still had a job. And then I was able to, for the last 45 years, make a living by writing books about things that I wanted to explore. I write books for myself, trying to figure out answers to questions. And if anybody else reads, that's great. Well, now everybody wants the internet to be free. All content should be free.
Right.
And so the good side is that you or anybody can write something today that can be read by thousands of people around the world today.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That has never happened before in history. So it's a great opportunity, but it's just hard to make a living. And I am glad that I lived when I did. I kind of lived under the old rules. I don't know about these new rules. In terms of creative content, I think it's really helpful, Ben, to develop an artistic community. It sounds fancy, but it just means people who want to create something, they get together and share it.
Yeah.
I know there's a good one in Nashville, for example. Andrew Peterson was one of the key guys in starting that. And these are people who get together and share the material. They read it out loud. They get that initial critique. And I guess I like that intermediate stage rather than just immediately going on a blog and putting down your first draft. That's not going to teach it to be any better.
Right.
And if you have a regular group you meet with, people you trust, the only people who help you are people who say, that really doesn't work.
Yeah.
when I share my stuff with readers, most of them say, "Oh, it's so good. It's so good." That doesn't help me at all. So I never go back to them.
Yeah.
I go back to cranks, people who write in the manuscript margin, "I am falling asleep. This is so boring." I think, well,
Yeah.
it stings, but I got to know that.
Yeah.
And I pay attention to them. So that intermediate layer of feedback before you actually publish, no matter what you publish, I think is important. And I do that too. I've got some people around me here in Colorado. So even before I publish a blog, my assistant and a couple of other people go through it and challenge me on this and that. And that's an important step that I need. Just in the same way, when I used to write articles for magazines, the editor would do that. And I think we all need that layer of editors before we publish, regardless of how we publish.
And I think, as you said, the medium that people write through now, it almost necessitates speed, and also it allows for it. Like, it allows for you to be lazy, right? Because you can write something or produce something and then just hit publish, and boom, it's gone.
Mhm.
And I so value the few rare people in my life who are willing to give real honest feedback, and yet it stings. Even after all these years,
Oh, it sure does.
you don't like it, do you? You have to keep
No.
asking for it, because I think the natural tendency is to avoid it and to want to just think,
Yeah.
no, everything I do is perfect the first time.
I had a funny experience along that line. Every once in a while, as you're writing, you come up with some phrase or some analogy that is kind of edgy, and you're not quite sure whether it works or whether it's pushing the envelope a little too far. So I do that all the time. And I had this one friend who I had never used as an editor before, and I asked him to give me some feedback, and he went through. And the funny thing is, he put little check marks by every one of those kind of experimental, artistic
Sure.
jumps for me. And I thought, oh, that's great. I was really cooking that day. Every one of these he likes, he understands. Hey, this is my kind of guy. And then he told me, no, those mean this needs extra work. This is not working. This is not working at all.
Yeah, check marks is a little deceiving there.
Right.
Yeah, it reminds me of, there's the brilliant book Creativity Inc. I don't know if you've had a chance, but it's the founder.
I have not.
It's the founder of Pixar. And he talks about what he developed was what he called a brain trust. And it was people in the industry, directors, writers, producers. The only rule was they could have no skin in the game. And they would, when they had problems with their writing or their scripts or their plots, they would bring it to this brain trust. And their job was to produce or provide, take it or leave it, brutal feedback.
Yeah.
And I've always had that in my mind. Like, I need a brain trust. I need people in my life who are like, this is just not good, and you need to make this better.
Yeah.
Even though that's not easy. What role does reading play in your writing? Because I feel like reading's kind of becoming rare, and maybe I'm not. I know some of the statistics are back and forth on that a little bit, but I had this maybe very anecdotal evidence of, I had a couple of younger guys, like young Gen Zs in my team, and I brought up some book, and they very almost proudly were like, "Oh, we don't read. Like, I don't read. Like, that's not." But they didn't say it with any sense of like shame or like, "Oh, I should, but I don't," like working out. No, just unashamedly, "Oh, we don't read." So I don't really know why you're bringing that up. What role does reading play in your writing? And then maybe a more narrow question is, what do you read? I mean, there's just so much. I sometimes feel like I'm just picking things out of the giant basket of options, and I just don't know. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah. Well, if I could turn this little camera here and you could see the rest of my office, you'd find 7,000 books. and that's my life for 45 years. That's what I've done. Reading is my way of thinking, for one thing, trying to figure out what I believe. And it's also my way of aspiring. It teaches me what good writing is.
Yeah.
So in the early days, I would come across people like an Annie Dillard or a Frederick Buechner, and they would explode. It just lit up. This is a new terrain I've never seen before. I didn't know you could do that with words, that you could carry people along and then hit them right at the end the way Frederick Buechner or an Annie Dillard does. And over the years, I've always kept a database. I started right when computers started, unfortunately. And so every time I read a book, I make notes in the front of the book and type in where that came from, what page number, where it is in my library. So if I'm going to write a book about Jesus, for example,
Sure.
on that database, I just pull up the word Jesus, and I'll have hundreds and hundreds of these references. And I go back to the books and I look at them through this filter now, because I know I'm going to write about Jesus. And that's my way of thinking. And some of it I wrestle with again. I don't see Jesus that way now, the way I used to when I read that 20 years ago, and I kind of work through that. And then it gives me the source material that I can use them as the authorities. So how do I choose what to read? I usually find a person that I experience as stimulating, that takes me in a new direction, and I try to read everything they've done.
Sure.
So, I went through a Henry Nouwen stage and a Richard Foster stage, and of course a C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton and the Dorothy Sayers. And these were the foundations of my faith. And frankly, I think it's only that kind of committed, deep reading that has allowed great writing over the years. And I fear for the future, because I see these, the way we shorten everything, even these one-word sentences now, and the little abbreviations that you see in emails and messages, and even books are becoming more like emails, just quick things to get through.
Right.
And boy, I think that's going to catch up to us, especially if you're trying to deal with things like our faith, what we believe, and consider alternatives. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? You can't do that with these little one-word sentences with little blippo messages that come over the internet, and then you just hit delete as soon as you read them. That doesn't bode well for our future.
No, and I feel like I struggle with the tension of, I've heard you say in other places that we're not going to write something new, right? So it's more about your take on it. It's about what would God have me say on this topic, maybe through the lens of the life that I've lived. But we do live in a culture, I think, that values producing things more than learning and absorbing and living and experiencing. And so it's all about, you gotta produce. And so even if you're not qualified, even if you don't really have anything to say, even if you're not necessarily very interesting on that topic, you got to keep putting stuff out there. It's more about output than it is absorbing. And I guess my struggle or question would be, how do you know when you're even ready to write anything? And should that be a long process? Like, should anyone in their 20s even be writing something? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not in my 20s, I got kids, but you know what I mean? When do you write? When is that moment where you're like, now I'm ready to write on this particular topic?
I had the great fortune of starting out. My very first job, real job, was writing for a youth magazine called Campus Life magazine back in the early 1970s. And it was wonderful because I was around words all day. And they would assign me write the liner notes to some record album. Well, I didn't know anything about music, especially, Jesus music kind of in the 1970s. Or they'd say, write a brochure copy on why you should buy this magazine. Well, I didn't know how to do that, but it forced me writing is about, I've got an idea, I've got a message. There's a target audience out there. What's the best form to get this message to that audience? Right. I mean, it's that simple. It's me and the audience out there in the form I choose. And so I did that in so many different areas. Our magazine had a column, this shows you how dated it was, called Girl Whirl. So it was, advice on makeup and fashion and that kind of stuff. Well, the person who wrote that column regularly quit unexpectedly, and we've got to go to press. So for the next 3 months, I wrote the Girl Whirl column. And it actually, that kind of, it was a good experience for me to have to put myself in somebody else's shoes. That's what we do as writers. And then think about the audience and think about, how can I reach that audience? That's what writing is. Huh. So I had that kind of built in by my job. And I don't know how you do it starting off. It's so easy now for anybody to start writing a a blog or doing a podcast or something,
Right.
your question, when should I start
Right.
or when should I not start, is an excellent question. But, as long as you're producing, as long as you're cranking out words, you will eventually find out this one worked, this one did not work.
Sure.
So the good thing about blogs, you can get immediate feedback. You can kind of see,
Did anyone care?
how many people tuned in and how long, how many seconds they spent before they bounced to somebody else. So you have immediate feedback that I never had.
Right.
We got it 2 months later after we did a survey of the January issue in March,
So again, that's one of those opportunities of our modern age of writing, I guess. So
Exactly.
good and bad, probably like every age, right? So I'd love to talk about your story. So gripping, and there's so many parallels in it, as I said, to the work that I think still goes on as it relates to reaching people. I feel like the way your story progressed, I encounter that kind of person all the time, not maybe to those exact details or even maybe that extreme, although sometimes, but very powerful. And so I'm sure you've told it a million times, but would you mind just sharing the basics of your story? Like, how'd you end up where you are today? Very basic question.
Sure. Yeah. I told the whole story in this book called Where the Light Fell, and that's a memoir, and I've waited almost 50 years to write that book, which I call a prequel. It goes back and explains why I write about the things that I write, suffering and grace primarily. And we all have a story. You hear Christian testimonies. Oh, I was saved from drugs. I was saved from alcohol or sex addiction or something. My story is I was saved from a toxic church. I grew up in the South, in the middle of the civil rights movement, and my church was on the wrong side of everything. It was anti-civil rights. It saw Black people of color, as inferior. They'll never reach beyond a certain level. It was very legalistic. These days, the evangelical church in the U.S. is primarily fixated on politics. It wasn't true when I was growing up. Back then, it was fixated on rules, don't do this, don't do that.
Right.
Very legalistic church. And we're trying to be more spiritual, more holy than other people. And my story is realizing over time that not everybody who claims to speak for God actually does so. Mm-hmm. That started when I was very young. I was just a year old. There was a pandemic going on. It wasn't COVID-19, it was polio.
Yeah.
And my father got polio, a serious case, overnight. He was 23 years old, freshly out of the Navy in World War II. And then he married my mother and had 2 kids pretty quickly. My brother was 2 years older, and then I was just 1 year old. And when my father got sick, he was carried away, completely paralyzed. And there was only one hospital that had an iron lung in Atlanta. It was a charity hospital. He didn't get good care. He was in there for a couple of months. And he was planning to be a missionary, Ben. They were going to go to Africa. They had a mailing list of several thousand people who agreed to support them and pray for them. And those people decided, can't possibly be God's will for my father to die. So if we pray hard enough, maybe he'll be healed.
Yeah.
And they started praying and finally convinced word of prophecy that he would be healed. And they, against all medical advice, removed him from the iron lung. And it looked like he showed a little bit of improvement. But a few days later, just a couple of weeks, he died.
Yeah.
And that determined my life. It was a crushing blow to my mother, who was one of those who believed in God, that God was going to heal him. And of course, she was unprepared for life. She had moved from Philadelphia. She's now in the South. She has no money, no income, and just kind of scraped by. And that determined my childhood. We lived in a trailer home most of the time, very small, 8 foot wide, 48 foot long, and 3 of us in that trailer. And then she kind of went off the rails in certain ways. I wasn't aware of it at the time when you're growing up. That's just normal life, you know?
That's all you know.
You think every family's like that. But people who read the memoir now say, oh boy, there was some mental illness going on in your family. And then I started encountering other things that caused me to question the church, because we believe we had the truth. We were the ones who knew it all, who were going to heaven. Everybody else was going to hell. Heaven was a very small place. Hell was a very large place.
Right.
And one of the things that was a trigger for me was race, because we were taught that Black people were inferior. They make good servants. I mean, it's hard to even say these things now, but that's what we were taught.
It's crazy.
And people were calling Martin Luther King, who was, of course, Atlanta native, Martin Lucifer Coon. That was the word they used for it in church.
Yeah.
And I went to work one day. I got a fellowship at the Communicable Disease Center, now called the Center for Disease Control. And I polished up because I knew my supervisor was a man named Dr. Cherry. He was a renowned biochemist who was specializing in staining bacteria. I tried reading some of his papers and I couldn't even understand them. I'm a sophomore in high school. And I walk in to meet him the first day, and Dr. Cherry is a Black man, African American.
Huh.
And bells go off, warning bells, ding, 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 ding. It was clear the church had lied to me about race. And if the church lied to me about race, maybe they lied to me about the Bible, about Jesus.
Yeah.
So I went through a period, an agnostic period, questioning everything, just kind of suspending it. My brother, again, was 2 years older, and he went a different direction. He also realized the things we were told growing up just weren't true. So he was going to go as far away from them as he could possibly do. He became one of Atlanta's original hippies. He kind of fried his brain on LSD, moved to California like most hippies. And
you said he had in the book, you said he had a mustache and long hair, and I currently have a mustache and long hair.
Oh, no.
And I thought,
Watch it.
I'm not doing this just to relate. I promise. This is, the mustache is new, much to my wife's chagrin, but the hair has been here for a while. Just let me ask one quick question.
Yeah.
Why your mom doubled down on this fundamentalism instead of rejecting it because of the tragic experience that she faced? Why do you think that is? Why do you think, instead of, because you would think that there may have been just as likely of a chance that she looked at what happened to her husband and the failure of that, of God intervening there, and she could have gone in the other direction. Maybe. Why do you think that she, rather than going, I'm out, in maybe the similar way that your brother did, or you did eventually, why did she double down?
She was a devout person. She really believed it.
Sure.
And years later, I wrote a book called Disappointment with God, and I'm sure she looked at that and thought, how can you even use those words, disappointment with God? God is God. We're the ones who are wrong here.
Sure.
And the other thing that happened is that I describe in the book this scene where she dedicated her sons, my brother and me, to fulfill my father's mission that he was going to do. And the story was like Hannah offering her son Samuel in the temple to God.
Yeah.
And we were just normal teenagers. We weren't bad kids at all. But if we didn't become a missionary in Africa, then we were rebelling against God. So all that disappointment and probably anger that she could have directed toward God, she instead directed toward us.
Ugh.
So my brother and she haven't seen each other in 52 years yet. There was a complete split there. Yeah. And I'm a little closer in her thinking. I'm a little closer to where I should be than my brother is. He's an atheist. I write Christian books, but it's not her form of Christianity, so she claims she doesn't read my books, which is probably a good thing. But she really believed. She had a conversion experience. She really believed, and she believed that God would ultimately answer the prayers for my father through her two sons. And her frustration about that is what drove her to take some pretty extreme measures.
Yeah. Okay. So your brother, he enters into the hippie movement.
Yeah.
How does the story progress from there?
Well, then I went to Wheaton College and got a graduate degree, and that's when I I started as a magazine editor, and in those days, my faith was still up in the air. I call it a cocoon phase
Sure.
because I was still trying to figure it out. And I came across this man who is something like a saint to me and ultimately became a father figure. His name was Dr. Paul Brand. So for about 10 years, I followed him around and wrote books with him, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, In His Image, The Gift of Pain. He was an orthopedic surgeon, brilliant. He was offered the head of orthopedics
Wow.
at Stanford and at Oxford University and turned them down to work among the lowest people on the entire planet. And I promise you, it doesn't get any lower on the social scale than somebody in the Dalit caste, the
In
untouchable,
India. Yeah.
in India, who had leprosy.
Wow.
That is the very bottom. They're kicked out of their home, their village. They live off in a cave somewhere. People take a little bucket of slop food for them.
Yeah.
And here's this brilliant orthopedic surgeon who spent his life among them. He was kind of like Mother Teresa with a modern laboratory.
Wow.
Because he was a brilliant scientist, made all sorts of discovery, and his book on hand surgery is still used in medical schools today. And Dr. Brand had a fully integrated faith. And when I look back, I almost feel like God said, okay, Philip, I've shown you the worst that the church has to offer. Let me show you the best.
Yeah.
And that was true. And then later I started writing for Christianity Today. And I would go to those people I wanted to learn from. I wanted to be like, and I wanted to emulate. And over the years, I've been free just to explore my faith and try to come to terms with it and sift through the mixed messages I was given as a kid. This is worth keeping. This is heresy. I got to throw this out. I got to keep this one.
Right.
And it's been wonderful. I feel blessed. That truly is the right word. I feel blessed to be able to spend my life doing that, thinking through, struggling through, and then going to people who can help me. And I'm sure you've heard the phrase ex-evangelicals.
Oh,
There are
yeah.
a lot of people, there are a lot of people who grew up in circumstances a little bit like mine, probably not as severe, but, they went to a young life camp, they went to a small group at church or something and have good memories of it, but then somewhere along the way, the church failed them.
Right.
Either the way it treated somebody, the way it treated gay people, the way it told them stuff about science that they later found out was not true. And I've often been in conversation with these people and they'll say, what do you do? I'm a Christian author. Oh, really? Well, I used to be into that kind of stuff. Well, what happened? And they tell me their story. And I say, oh, it's a lot worse than that. And I said, they turned to me and said, wait a minute, I thought you were a Christian author. And I said, well, I am. But it would be a bad trade to trade away the possibility to connect with the God of the universe who created everything there is.
Right.
Because of the way the church failed you 30 years ago. That's a bad trade.
Yeah.
And I've been blessed through the grace of God. I've been able to climb back to a robust faith
Right.
that has defined my career for 4 decades.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. Deconstruction is such a in vogue term. It's very divisive and contentious. Some people think it's crucial. Other people think it's just become popular and people jump on that bandwagon. One of your quotes from your book that I love is, you say, I bend over backwards to honor the stance of a skeptic. And I just found that so inspiring. And I can hear that in your writing, and I can hear that now. With that whole process or the approach you take to someone who's going through that process, you obviously, your story in many ways is a story of deconstruction. And then, like you said, by God's grace, reconstruction. What role in your mind does revelation play in that? Because that is a big part of your story too, right? You had this supernatural encounter with God.
Right.
And
I did.
And I have found that I'm able to counter some of the deconstruction arguments, like you just mentioned. Hey, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Look, no one lives up to their ideals, and you can't reject Jesus because of bad Christians and all that. But it feels like often what's missing is that sort of renewed sense of the presence of God, or maybe for the first time for it to become from something academic to something that they've experienced for themselves. Could you talk a little bit about the role that that played in your life and maybe how important that is for someone who's going through that experience today?
Yeah. I think there was a stage before the experience you refer to. The name of this book that tells my story is called Where the Light Fell.
Yeah.
That comes from a quote by St. Augustine, who said, I couldn't look at the sun directly, but I could look on where the light fell. And that was my story, because I couldn't look at the sun directly. I was scorched by that sun. You know, I had this image of God as this scowling, angry, murderous, just cop up in the sky trying to smash people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the three things that initially softened me, I would say, because to get through high school and get through the home experience, I developed this really hard shell. I don't feel pain. I don't feel cold. That kind of stuff that teenagers do. And
even being willing to try to even breaking your arm to prove that.
Yeah,
process.
I did that. I did. Yeah. We didn't have cutters back then, but probably I would have been a cutter.
Yeah.
If I knew I could have back then. But the three things for me were classical music. That was my one solace. Well, two, actually. And nature is another one. We always lived near the woods in Atlanta because we were living in trailer parks. Nobody wants to live near them. They put them out in the middle of nowhere. And I would go out in the woods, and I loved insects, and I loved plants and trees, and the closest thing that I had to a spiritual experience took place in nature. So you got nature, you got music, and then romantic love occurred to me when I was still in my teens too, in college. And those three things softened me, and they made me question in a good way, wait a minute, that image of God that I have, the scowling super cop in the sky, couldn't possibly be true. Because if God created these things, he's not that scowling super cop.
Sure.
And there was a quote I came across that G.K. Chesterton said. He said, the worst moment for an atheist is when he feels a deep sense of gratitude and has no one to thank.
Right. Yeah.
And that's how I felt. I was ready, but I had grown up in this church environment. I knew how to give testimonies. I knew how to pray. I knew how to do that stuff. And then I had decided for years that it was all fake.
Right.
And one year I went to camp, and 1 week I was the camper of the week. The next week they tried to kick me out. I believed the whole thing was a game. It was just this learned behavior stuff and then I did have this revelation that was unplanned and undesired, unsought, that I've never talked about in full detail before. The reason is I'm not trying to set up a standard, say, look, you need one of these.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't have them. My wife didn't have a revelation like that.
Right.
But in my particular circumstances, I think God knew I needed something I needed a kick in the butt,
Sure. Yeah.
Something that I could not possibly say, well, that was just me projecting, or it was me manufacturing some spiritual experience. I didn't want it.
Yeah.
I didn't like those Christians around me. And yet I had been softened. I had been prepared. And when I realized that God is not that super cop, God is compassionate, loving, grace-filled God, and all the good things on earth are reflections of that God. And then I realized, here I am kicking and screaming, and I'm probably the neediest one of all, and was transformed from that one night.
Yeah,
my life changed forever, and that happens for some people, and for some people take a different path. God finds what we need.
Yeah.
But I had been softened and was ready, and then it happened.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate your commitment to the idea that it's not a formula, because I think it's maybe similar to the way you meet and fall in love with your spouse, right? We can hold up these overly idealized ideas of what it should look like. I even think about my parents' story, and I always had that in my mind. Like, this is how it's supposed to look. It's supposed to be quick, and you're supposed to just, get married in a month after you meet. There was these paradigms in my head that I had to actually overcome when it came to even meeting and then eventually marrying my own wife. And so I think in the same
Yeah.
way, if we're not careful, we can turn, highly personal experiences that God in his grace ordains for each person and make them into things that we now chase as yet another religious formula that adds more of a burden than a freedom. So I really do appreciate that. On that, I love that whole section and where the title of your book comes from. One quote I found so great was, goodness has become, this was in sort of in response to love. Goodness has become believable. I feel inspired to dismantle the shell, rejoin the human race, and stop being a jerk. And I totally relate to that. And that's a working process in progress in my life. But what I love about that is, as I said, in our mission, everything we do is about trying to communicate the love of Jesus outside of the church to you, basically, the person who either has no experience or a jaded experience. And we need to kind of weave through those experiences and that baggage to say, no, there is the truth of Jesus for you to experience. And one of the things we often talk about is we need to learn how to have spiritual conversations in a non-religious way. And what I mean by that is that, as you say, there is evidence of God everywhere in nature and beauty and art. I'm a musician too, and I connect with people on that level. And it is, as you say, everywhere if people would be willing to look. But I feel like, similar to maybe your experience where you were told to get out there with the tracts and the door-to-door evangelism, we still kind of utilize that method of gospel presentation outside of the church, rather than looking at all of this embedded transcendence outside of the church, and maybe use that as a common ground starting point that would lead to a gospel conversation. Do you feel like you discovered that, and it sounds like in some ways on your own, but do you think that would be, or that's an underutilized approach by the church to recognize love, nature, music as starting grounds that could be the fertilizer for spiritual conversations leading to the gospel?
Yeah, I do. In fact, one of the most powerful books of apologetics I've read it in a long time is a book by Tom Holland.
Oh,
called
Dominion?
Dominion. Yeah. And Tom is not a Christian. He's very, very close, but he's not quite there.
We had him on the podcast, actually.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Yeah. And as you know, I mean, he starts out, he was a classics scholar, so he specialized in Greece and Rome. And then the more he read about Greece and Rome, he realized these are pretty brutal, awful societies. They exploit people. They have slaves. They are misogynist. I mean, they're just brutal. And as he looked at history, he realized that everything that he valued, human rights and care for the poor and humility and care for the sick and care for the earth and, freeing slaves and all that, everything that was important to him came from Christians throughout history. And he never quite, at least from the last I heard, never quite has stepped over and said, okay, I'm one of them. I believe in Jesus died for me and the resurrection and all that. But he says, basically, by your fruits you shall know them. And that, I think that is something that people don't think about, because especially today when Christians take some particular political point of view, if you have a different point of view, you oppose them and you think it's because they're Christians. Well, not necessarily. Look at the world before Christ and look at the world after Christ. Sure. And that's what he did in this book, Dominion, big, thick 600-page book, where he just went point by point and said, education, science, all of these things came out of Christian sources. So the light fell for me on those particular three things, but it's actually fallen on the world and shown itself in remarkable ways that define who we are as people, the things that we value.
Yeah, it's such a powerful testimony.
I went to Sweden one time. First time I went, I was very impressed. And man, what a great country! It's charitable. People are honest. They're relatively friendly. They're still Swedes, but they care for the earth. Yeah, I know, they care for the earth. they're just good people. It's a clean, great place to visit.
It's like IKEA, just scale.
There you go, IKEA. Well, I happened to be reading a book at the time on the history of Europe. And I had just read, before we went to Stockholm, that for 250 years, most prayers on the continent in Europe ended with this prayer, this line: "Lord, save us from the Vikings. Amen." And I thought, wait a minute, what happened to transform this place that used to be full of warring, pillaging, raping monsters into modern day Sweden? Well, the gospel happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can come back and say, well, most Swedes don't even believe in God, which is true.
Right.
But Jesus said that's how the kingdom of God works. It's like a little seed falls into the ground, grows into a great bush, and the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. And I think that's what Tom Holland is saying in this book. Look at the branches, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look at the fruit that came out of this thing, and he's not quite there, but boy, he's mighty close.
Yeah, he was very gracious, and he points to the dinosaurs. He points to sort of the incredulity of thinking the whole thing could be about just us. And I don't know,
right.
It's hard, right? It's and I would say similar to a Jordan Peterson. There's this clear resonance with the realities of God woven into existence, and yet there's that last step of submission that I think is it can be a chasm for some people, especially very brilliant people often. But yeah, so we'll keep praying for them. Yeah, you're sorry,
a chasm or a bridge, actually. Sure. I don't know if you've read Bono's latest memoir, Surrender. I have not. Surrender. He says that's the theme of my life, and it was only until I could do that. And he makes it very simple. He said there are two ways to look at Earth. It either runs by karma, where you get what you deserve, or it runs by grace, where you don't get what you deserve. And he said, I'm going to go with grace. I know myself too well. I don't trust that karma stuff.
No, it's a better gamble at the very least. Yikes. So from what I understand, there's been some pretty serious developments in your health. You've been very open about that. I've been reading your blog, and yeah, would you be willing to share about that? I think it's your insights into that. Like you said, you've been writing about grace and suffering for a long time. Well, this kind of seems to continue that theme. Would you mind sharing a little bit?
Sure. It started almost exactly a year ago when I was skiing. I live in Colorado and ski whenever I can.
Yeah.
And there were some trees around, and I was making a right-hand turn, and I gave my orders to my legs to change my skis in a way that I would turn right. And they just disobeyed. They didn't follow my orders.
Wow.
And I smashed into a tree, and I was not able to ski for the next couple of months from a leg injury. And just kind of tucked that away. That's strange, because I knew how to turn right, and I gave those orders, but it just didn't work. And then over the next year, I found little other cases where my body just wasn't working the way that it had been working. And then people would say things like, you're moving kind of slow today, Philip. And so finally I got to get this checked out. And just in early 2023, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And it's a strange syndrome. They don't know where it comes from. It's incurable, and it's wildly unpredictable. There are some people who can live with it for 25 years, and you could hardly tell they have it. There are other people who are all bent over and can hardly walk and are crippled. Doesn't kill you, but it can make life really miserable. And also, you can die with Parkinson's, but not probably from Parkinson's. So that was a wake-up call. I'm an outdoors person. I live in Colorado. My wife and I have climbed all 54 mountains over 14,000 feet. I have been exercising for 50 years, running and doing all that stuff. Like skiing, like a lot of outdoor sports, mountain biking, and one by one, I'm going to have to let some of those go. The week after my diagnosis, I tried a new sport, pickleball. And that was a mistake. You think, well, that's a sport for senior citizens, right? Well, I was diving for a ball and tripped, and I had no reflex at all. You put out your hand, you kind of break your fall, and I fell smack on my face and ended up in the emergency room for 8 hours that day. And I realized life is different now. Life is going to be a bit of letting go. And in a sense, any of us who reach a certain age, you start doing that. And, I can't do things that I used to do. You start letting go of things that are important to you. And as you say, I've written a lot of books. Wrote a book called, my first book was Where is God When It Hurts? And another one, Disappointment with God, the question that goes away, all of which circle around that important question of why there's so much pain and suffering in the world, and how should we live? How should we cope? And I've interviewed a lot of people. I've thought through that a lot and came away with a slogan, almost like a mantra on pain. And it goes like this: that pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed.
Yeah.
When we hurt, we want God to just take it away, to heal us. Well, it obviously doesn't happen all the time. It happens sometimes, I believe, but not all that often, because everybody eventually dies, and most people who are dying are saying, heal me, Lord. And the same percentage of Christians die, I found, as non-Christians, 100%.
Yeah, still the same.
Yeah. And I have learned over the years from people who, you can suffer bad or suffer good. People who suffer bad are just miserable, and they make everybody around them miserable. The people who suffer well are people who somehow find a way to redeem it. And in my books, I've often told stories of people like Johnny Erickson Tada and many others who started out saying, oh God, if you could just do one thing in my life, take away this problem. And later looked back and say, God, that was the greatest gift you gave me, because out of that, and they go on and tell their stories. And C.S. Lewis uses this phrase. He wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. And he said that God whispers to us in the good times and shouts to us through a megaphone in pain and suffering. It's the megaphone of God. And Ben, I've always struggled a little bit with that analogy, the megaphone of God, because I don't think God is saying, okay, you get polio, Philip's father, and you get leukemia, you 3-year-old daughter. I don't think that's the way it is. I can tell you why it's not. And when people around Jesus would try to pin him down on stuff like that, he would blow away their theories. But the pattern we have is that out of bad things, good things can come.
Yeah.
Out of terrible things, great things can come. Out of the worst thing, the murder, the execution of God's own son, wonderful things can come. The salvation of the human race, the resurrection,
right?
Life ever after. That's the pattern,
right?
We live on a broken planet, a spoiled planet, beautiful planet, wonderful planet, but it's got some problems. It's a broken planet.
Yeah,
we have a promise that it will be remade one day, and we also have a promise that we are part of that redemptive process by being faithful. And I kind of look on this new chapter. That's my stewardship.
Sure.
I've interviewed people, and I have found that people I've interviewed are more likely to be stewards of hard things, of suffering and of poverty even, than the people I know who are stewards of happy things and success and riches.
Right.
When I look up the two side by side, the unlikeliest people are the ones who impress me most. And Jesus, of course, go back and read the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the Beatitudes. Who is he talking about? The rich people, the successful people? No.
Right.
Oddly enough, the blessed ones are the ones who believe that and allow God to make good things out of bad things.
Wow. Well, I'm really encouraged by your attitude and perspective in this difficult time. And my thought goes to people who face this world with no God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how do you do that? And especially in an age now where youth and being strong and being beautiful, when these flimsy, fleeting things are held up as what makes life worth living, and it's so unattainable. And if it is attainable for only so long, I was laughing that, my kids are now apparently Gen Alpha. And I was having this funny fantasy in my head about the day when they will mock Gen Zs, like how my kids will eventually make fun of these old crusty Gen
Yeah.
Zs, and
Yeah.
how you're young and cool for so short of a time.
Yeah.
And then you're
Yeah.
not. And it's just, it just, it screams to the need to be preaching the good news, because man, facing this world with those kinds of measurements of success when
Sure.
life will happen, I just it really makes me feel grateful for the understanding and relationship with the Lord that I have, but also compassion for those who don't and who need to be told, because how do you face this world without God?
Boy, that came home to me in a stark way, because I've written about pain. I'm often called when there's a problem like Columbine
Sure.
shootings, Virginia Tech, and the hardest one by far was when I was called to go to Newtown, Connecticut after the Sandy Hook killings there. These 26 and 7-year-old children slaughtered, massacred in their school, and people said we're having these 2 community-wide meetings. There'll be more than 1,000 people at each one, and these people are just speechless. They're heartbroken. Could you come and minister to them? Man, what can I say? I happened to be reading some of the new atheists at the time, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. And I had a collection of quotes. I was writing an article for Books and Culture magazine, a collection of quotes about how this universe is exactly what we should expect. If there's no good or evil, there's no, there's
just blind, pitiless indifference.
Right. Blind, pitiless indifference. That's the word that Dawkins uses. And I was watching, like the New York Times, because when a tragedy like that happens, or 9/11, it's funny, they never call on Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens in their op-ed pages. They go to priests and pastors and rabbis.
Yeah.
And we don't act like the universe is blind, pitiless indifference. No parent, as Sandy Hook says, oh, well, that's too bad. I lost one child, but I got another one at home. Everything's fine now. No, the rest of their lives, they're hardly defined by that shattering event. We treat them as if they matter, as if something was cut off. And I could go to them and say, you can reunite with your child. Let me tell you how Jesus treated children. He said, suffer the children to come to me. He said, I go away to prepare a home for you. And we have hope. We have belief that there's something more than that 6-year-old life, that human being will be resurrected. And here I thought it was going to be this big challenge to my faith, this dark moment. How can you possibly explain it? And then compared to the other message that you get, I said to them, I wrote a book called Where is God When It Hurts? That's a really hard question.
Yeah.
But there's an even harder question, and that is, where is no God when it hurts? Yeah. That's tough. If you could just stand in front of those parents and say, too bad, it's blind, pitiless indifference. What do you expect from a random universe?
Yeah.
It doesn't do it. It doesn't feed them the nourishment they need.
No resilience in suffering. And I think that's one of the greatest apologetics. Philip, I have been really, really encouraged and blessed by this conversation. Thank you for your time. You could be talking to a lot of people, so I really appreciate it. And everyone needs to go get this book. Is your website the best place to stay in regular contact with
Philip Yancey, philipyancey.com.
Okay, and I'll put that link in the description, and we'll make sure we share that everywhere. And I know my prayer is that he just continues to use you even more powerfully in the days to come than he has in the past. And if you wouldn't mind, could I pray that over you? And
please
and over
do.
us? Okay,
please.
Jesus, I am greatly encouraged by all that you have done through Philip, Lord, and I thank you for his life. I thank you for his testimony. I thank you for his resilience in the face of a difficult past, Lord. It's not been easy, and yet you've been faithful. And you have truly, he is a living testimony of your redemption in hardship. And that gives me great courage for whatever comes in my life in the days to come. And I'm sure it does as well for those listening. But Lord, I ask now in your mighty power that you would fully realize everything you have for Philip in the days to come, that the days ahead would be the best days, the most prosperous, fruitful, impactful, powerful days of his life. I pray that they would be filled with good times, and that you would allow him to do the things that he loves. You would allow him to see you in nature and music and in love the way he has all his life. Let him maybe experience those things even more powerfully than he has in the past. And I pray for more, Lord. I pray for more fruit, that as he continues to offer his 5 loaves and 2 fish, let them be multiplied even more ridiculously. Let them be multiplied even more beyond what makes sense, Lord, as you have already done. And I just pray you would bless my dear brother. Thank you for his life and his example. And I just pray for great days ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.